Imagine a prisoner forced to share a cell with a portrait of the home they can never return to. That is the psychological reality of modern Armenia. Every morning, the citizens of Yerevan wake up to a skyline dominated by a colossus, a snow-capped volcanic cone rising over 5,000 meters into the atmosphere. It is Mount Ararat. It is the central symbol of their national identity, the centerpiece of their coat of arms, and the resting place of Noah's Ark in their holiest texts. It is massive, it is beautiful, and it is completely, legally, and militarily inaccessible to them. To walk toward it is to walk into the barrel of a gun. The mountain that defines the Armenian soul does not belong to Armenia. It belongs to Turkey. You're watching Unclimbed Earth, mapping the geography of silence. If you value this depth of geopolitical analysis, subscribing ensures you don't miss the next investigation into the world's most forbidden frontiers. To understand the gravity of this dislocation, you must first understand the geography of the view. In most border disputes, the contested land is hidden away in remote mountain passes or obscured by distance. Not here. Ararat is not a distant rumor. It is an overwhelming physical presence. It looms over the Armenian capital like a planetary body, so close that on clear days you can see the texture of the ice cap from a balcony in the city center. It feels within walking distance. Yet, between the observer in Yerevan and the slopes of the mountain lies the Ararat River, and along that river runs a fortified line of barbed wire, watchtowers, and Russian border guards patrolling the frontier of the former Soviet Union. This is one of the most sealed borders on Earth, a scar of iron and silence that turns a geographical neighbor into a phantom. This is not simply a story about a mountain. It is a story about the amputation of a nation's geography. For thousands of years, the Armenian highlands were not just where Armenians lived. They were the physical container of their civilization. Ararat was the center, not the edge. To see it on the horizon today, sitting firmly within the Republic of Turkey, creates a phenomenon that sociologists and geographers call phantom limb pain, applied to an entire country. The population can feel the mountain, they can see it, they can paint it and sing about it, but the nerve endings were severed a century ago. The severance was bureaucratic, brutal, and permanent. The story of how Ararat was lost is not ancient history. It is a modern geopolitical tragedy forged in the chaos following World War I. To trace the fault line, we must look to the ashes of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of the Bolsheviks. In the early 20th century, the map of this region was liquid. Boundaries were melting and reforming with every season of warfare. The Armenians, having survived the systematic extermination of 1915, looked to the collapsing Russian Empire and the Western powers to secure a homeland that included their historic territories. For a brief, flickering moment in history, it seemed possible. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 promised a Wolsonian Armenia, a state that would have included vast swathes of what is now eastern Turkey, securing Ararat and the coastline for the new republic. But maps drawn in Paris parlors rarely survive the friction of the ground. While Western diplomats drew lines on paper, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was forging a new Turkish nationalist movement in the Anatolian interior, and the Bolsheviks were consolidating power in Moscow. Armenia was the pawn caught between these two rising tides. The fledgling First Republic of Armenia, starving and isolated, could not hold back the Turkish advance from the west and the Soviet pressure from the east. By late 1920, the dream of a greater Armenia had collapsed into a fight for mere survival. The fate of the mountain was sealed in a series of treaties that remain open wounds in the Caucasus today. The Treaty of Moscow and the subsequent Treaty of Kars in 1921 were the instruments of this partition. These were cold, cynical negotiations between the Soviet Union and the new Grand National Assembly of Turkey. The Bolsheviks, desperate to secure their southern flank and hoping to court Ataturk as a socialist ally against British imperialism, were willing to trade land that wasn't theirs to give. In these smoke-filled rooms, the borders were redrawn with a razor blade. The Soviets gifted the regions of Kars, Ardahan, and the surreally symbolic Mount Ararat to Turkey. In exchange, the Soviets secured control over the port of Batumi in present-day Georgia and solidified their grip on the diminished Soviet Armenia. It was a transaction of territory for stability. The border was pushed east, behind the Ararat River, leaving the ruins of the ancient Armenian capital of Ani and the sacred peak of Ararat on the Turkish side. The ink on the Treaty of Kars dried, and the Iron Curtain fell across the valley. The mountain was locked away. For decades, during the Cold War, this border was the front line between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Ararat became a militarized zone, a strategic high ground for monitoring Soviet airspace. For the Armenians living under Soviet rule, the mountain became a forbidden image, a daily reminder of their subjugation and their loss. They were told by Moscow that national borders were meaningless in the socialist utopia, yet they were staring at a border that meant everything. The geopolitical cruelty is compounded by the specific topography of the region. The Ararat River Valley is flat and dry, creating a natural theater where the mountain rises without preamble. There are no foothills to hide it. It stands in isolation, a volcanic cone of 5,137 meters, or 16,854 feet. From the Turkish side, the approach is gradual, a long drive through the dusty plains of Igdir. But from the Armenian side, it is a wall. The psychological impact of this verticality cannot be overstated. It dominates the visual field of the entire Ararat plain, where the bulk of Armenia's population lives. It is the backdrop to their weddings, their funerals, and their political protests. This visual proximity creates a unique kind of torment. In other territorial disputes, like the Kuril Islands or Kashmir, the contested land is often a zone of active habitation or resource extraction. Here, the dispute is metaphysical as much as it is territorial. Turkey controls the rock and ice. Armenia controls the image and the memory. The Turkish government has, at times, bristled at this appropriation. There have been diplomatic spats where Turkish officials questioned why Armenia features a mountain on its coat of arms that is not within its sovereign territory. The Soviet diplomat Andrei Gromyko is said to have famously retorted, "Turkey has the moon on its flag, but does it lay claim to the moon?" While the retort is witty, it masks the deep asymmetry of the situation. The moon is neutral ground. Ararat is not. The mountain sits in a province that was historically cleared of its Armenian population. The villages that once dotted its lower slopes are gone or renamed. The names on the maps have been Turkified. The geography has been scrubbed of its previous tenants. This is what makes the view from Yerevan so jarring. It is a view of a crime scene where the evidence has been paved over, yet the landmark remains untouched, witnessing the silence. Today, the border remains hermetically sealed. There are no crossing points. The railway lines that once connected Gyumri to Kars are rusting, overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. To travel from Yerevan to the mountain that shadows it, one must fly to a third country, usually Georgia or via a longer route, and enter Turkey from the other side, a journey of hundreds of kilometers to reach a point that is physically only 30 kilometers away. This detour is a physical manifestation of the diplomatic impasse. The silence of the Ani ruins, just a few kilometers north of the mountain, amplifies this desolation. Ani, once a metropolis rivaling Constantinople, sits literally on the edge of the precipice overlooking the border river. The skeletal remains of its cathedrals stand in the military zone on the Turkish side. Armenian border guards watch them through binoculars. They watch tourists on the Turkish side walking through the ruins of their ancestors' cathedral, while they themselves are barred from stepping foot on the soil. It is a theater of the absurd, played out on a high-altitude stage. The lost nature of Ararat is not just about the past. It is an active, ongoing geopolitical standoff. The closed border suffocates the Armenian economy, turning the landlocked country into an island. The mountain is the ultimate symbol of this blockade. It stands as a sentinel of the closed gate. Every sunset that hits the snows of Ararat reflects back onto a city that is still waiting for the treaty to expire, still waiting for the geopolitical tectonic plates to shift once more. But geology moves slowly, and politics in this part of the world moves even slower. The mountain waits, indifferent to the flags planted on its summit or the tears shed in its shadow. It remains the most visible yet unreachable object in the Armenian world. The most disturbing reality of Mount Ararat isn't that it was taken, but that it has been transformed into a weapon. While the world views this peak as a biblical relic or a dormant volcano, modern military strategy views it as high ground. The snow-capped summit that dominates the skyline of Yerevan is effectively a NATO surveillance tower looking right back at the people who worship it. This is not merely a lost landmark. It is a fortress of geography where the line between heritage and hostility has been erased by barbed wire. To understand how a nation's soul ends up on the wrong side of a map, we must strip away the romanticism of antiquity and look at the cold, transactional nature of 20th century diplomacy. The border that currently severs Armenia from Ararat was not drawn by God or geology, but by two men in a room who cared little for the people living in the mountain's shadow. In 1921, the Treaty of Kars finalized the boundary between the Grand National Assembly of Turkey and Soviet Russia. It was a cynical exchange of territory, a geopolitical barter where the Bolsheviks, desperate to secure their southern flank and court the rising power of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, traded the Kars Oblast and the Sermilu district, including Ararat, for peace and influence. The ink on that treaty dried over a century ago, but the blood it spilled is still metaphorical and literal in the soil. When you stand on the banks of the Akurian River today, you are looking at one of the most rigid scars on the planet. This is not an open border. It is a sealed airlock. There are no crossing points. There is no trade. There is only a silence so profound that the sound of the wind moving through the dry grass feels like an intrusion. What makes this border even more surreal is the uniform of the men guarding it. If you were to walk up to the perimeter fence on the Armenian side, looking for a way toward the mountain, the soldiers who stop you would likely not be speaking Armenian. They would be speaking Russian. Under a decades-old agreement that survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, the border between Armenia and Turkey is patrolled by the Russian Federal Security Service, the FSB. It is a geopolitical paradox, an independent nation whose gateway to the west is locked by the soldiers of the north. The green caps of the Russian border guards are a constant visual reminder that while the map says Armenia, the strategic reality is still entangled in the ghost of the Soviet Empire. This layered complexity is exactly why we document these friction points. If analyzing the hidden mechanics of these forbidden zones adds value to your perspective, supporting this channel allows US to continue mapping the world's most restricted territories. The presence of the FSB adds a layer of geopolitical concrete to the situation. It means that Ararat is separated from Armenia not just by Turkish territory, but by a Russian security cordon. For the locals living in the villages of Margara or Luzarat, the mountain is a daily taunt. They wake up to its massive white cone filling their windows, reflecting the morning sun, appearing close enough to touch. Yet, to physically reach the base of the mountain, an Armenian citizen would have to fly to a third country, usually Georgia or somewhere in Europe, and then enter Turkey from the west, a detour of thousands of kilometers to cross a gap of less than 30. On the other side of the wire, the narrative shifts from loss to security. To the Turkish state, the region surrounding Ararat, known locally as Agri Dejai, is not a museum of Armenian history. It is a volatile security zone. For decades, the mountain's rugged, cavernous terrain served as a natural fortress for Kurdish insurgents. The Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, has utilized the deep ravines and inaccessible slopes of Ararat as hideouts and staging grounds. This reality has turned the mountain into a heavily militarized zone from the Turkish perspective as well. This is the irony that geology imposes on politics. The very features that make Ararat majestic, its isolation, its height, its complex topography, make it a nightmare for state control. Access to the mountain from the Turkish side has been sporadically banned, opened, and banned again depending on the intensity of counterinsurgency operations. There have been years where the mountain was closed to all climbers, foreign and domestic, effectively rendering it a no-man's land. In those periods, Ararat becomes truly unowned, a wild, violent monolith where the only human presence is the silent patrol of special forces and the ghosts of guerrilla fighters. The tension creates a specific kind of atmosphere at the Khor Virap monastery. This ancient site sits on a small hill in the Ararat plain, just meters from the closed border. It is the closest point an Armenian can get to the mountain without triggering an international incident. The monastery is famous for being the place where Saint Gregory, the Illuminator, was imprisoned in a pit for 13 years, a story of darkness and eventual redemption that mirrors the national psyche. Today, Khor Virap is a place of strange dissonance. Tourists flock here to take the iconic photo, the medieval stone church silhouetted against the overwhelming white backdrop of Ararat. They pose, they smile, they buy souvenirs. But if you turn your back to the church and look down at the flat expanse of the valley floor, the romance evaporates. You see the watchtowers. You see the distinct, unnatural line of the plowed earth strip that reveals footprints of anyone attempting to cross. You see the sterile gap between the two worlds. The silence here is heavy. It is not the peaceful silence of nature, but the tense silence of a held breath. You can watch cars moving on the Turkish highway on the slopes of the mountain. You can see the lights of the Turkish city of Igdir flickering at night. You are watching a life that is completely inaccessible to you. It creates a psychological claustrophobia, a sense of being trapped in a room with a window that cannot be opened. The tragedy of this border is not just in its existence, but in its permanence. Most borders in the world are porous. They breathe with trade and migration. Even hostile borders usually have checkpoints. But this frontier is a dead end. It effectively turns Armenia into an island, landlocked and blockaded on two sides, forcing the country to look north and south for its lifeline, while its eyes are permanently fixed to the west, on the mountain that isn't there. This fixation has consequences. It traps the national consciousness in a state of suspended grief. As long as the mountain is visible, the loss is fresh. Every sunrise that hits the peak serves as a reminder of the Treaty of Kars, of the genocide, of the Soviet betrayal, and of the current geopolitical isolation. Prevents the wound from scarring over. The mountain is not just a pile of rock. It is a member of the family that has been kidnapped and is being held hostage in the window across the street. But geology ignores treaties. Tectonic plates do not recognize the signatures of Bolsheviks or Pashas. The irony of the dispute is that the mountain itself is a ticking clock. Ararat is a stratovolcano. It is currently dormant, but certainly not dead. The fumaroles and seismic murmurs deep beneath the crust remind seismologists that the Earth is dynamic. While nations fight over who owns the surface, the pressures building underneath are indifferent to the flags planted above. A major eruption would devastate the plains on both sides of the Ararat River, burying the border fence, the watchtowers, and the political arguments in the same layer of gray ash. Until then, the standoff continues. The mountain looms, a white phantom suspended in the blue haze. It is the ultimate forbidden territory, so massive you cannot ignore it, so close you can count the ravines on its flank, yet separated by a distance that cannot be measured in kilometers, but in years of silence and hostility. The wire remains taut, the guards remain watchful, and the mountain waits. But the greatest tragedy of Mount Ararat isn't that it was taken. The tragedy is that it has been weaponized. While the world views this peak as a biblical relic or a mountaineering challenge, the Turkish military views it as high ground. This is not just a dormant volcano, it is a fortress. If you were to stand on the northern slopes today, looking down toward the Araxes River, you wouldn't just see the ruins of ancient civilizations. You would see the hardened infrastructure of modern warfare. Radar installations, listening posts, deep bunker fortifications carved into the very basalt that Armenians consider sacred. The shock isn't that the mountain is gone. The shock is that the symbol of Armenian survival is now being used as a surveillance platform to monitor the Armenian state itself. The mountain has been drafted into an army that denies its history. This militarization transforms the geography from a landscape of loss into a landscape of active threat. The border that runs along the river at the foot of the mountain is one of the most heavily fortified frontiers on the planet, a Cold War relic that never thawed. For decades, this was the precise line where NATO ended and the Soviet Union began. Today, the players have changed, but the tension remains absolute. Russian border guards still patrol the Armenian side, a lingering geopolitical hangover, while Turkish special forces monitor the slopes. The mountain is trapped in a grid of crosshairs, a prisoner of a war that technically isn't happening, yet never actually ended. To understand the depth of this erasure, we must look beyond the military maps to the cultural ones. The strategy employed here is not subtle. It is a systematic cleansing of nomenclature. In the official Turkish registry, the mountain is not Ararat.
It is Arda.
This renaming is part of a broader, state-sponsored initiative to sanitize the geography of Anatolia. It is a bureaucratic attempt to rewrite geology. By changing the names on the maps, the state attempts to sever the linguistic tendon connecting the people to the land. If you remove the name, you eventually remove the memory. This policy extends to the very ecosystem. In a move that borders on the absurd, the Turkish Ministry of Environment formally announced plans to alter the Latin names of certain animals found on the mountain, specifically those that contain the word Armenia or Armeniaca. The wild sheep, Ovis armeniana, was to be renamed to remove the ethnic designator. It is a level of pettiness that reveals a profound insecurity. A state confident in its history does not need to rename sheep to prove its ownership of a mountain. If uncovering these layers of geopolitical strategy helps you see the map differently, your support helps us continue documenting these forbidden zones. The physical erasure is even more violent than the linguistic one. Just west of Ararat lies the ghost city of Ani, the city of 1,001 churches. Once the capital of a medieval Armenian kingdom, it now sits desolate on the Turkish side of the closed border. The ruins of Ani serve as a grim preview of Ararat's cultural fate. For decades, these structures were left to the mercy of looters, earthquakes, and deliberate target practice by military units. The wind howls through the empty arches of the Cathedral of Ani, carrying the dust of a civilization that was not just conquered, but actively dismantled stone by stone. Ararat looms in the background of Ani like a silent witness, its snow-capped peak watching the slow disintegration of the kingdom it once anchored. Yet, the most excruciating aspect of this territorial dispute is the proximity. This is not a loss experienced from a distance. It is a loss that is visible every single morning. For the residents of Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, Ararat is not a memory. It is the dominant feature of their skyline. It rises massive and white above the smog of the city, so close that on clear days you can distinguish the crevices in the glaciers. It creates a psychological paradox unique in modern geography. A nation's heart lies just outside its body. Imagine looking out your window every day at your most sacred site, the place your grandmother told you stories about, the image stamped on your passport and your currency, and knowing that stepping foot on it would require a visa you likely cannot get to enter a country that officially denies your history. It is a form of psychological torture enacted through geography. The view from the monastery of Khor Virap, the closest point in Armenia to the mountain, is breathtakingly cruel. The barbed wire is right there. The watchtowers are visible. The mountain fills the entire sky, overwhelming the senses, yet it is as inaccessible as the moon. You can breathe the air coming off the slopes, but you cannot touch the rock. This pain of proximity drives the political stalemate we see today. Diplomatic protocols signed in Zurich in 2009 promised to open the border and establish a commission to examine the historical record. They failed. The protocols collected dust, unratified, until they were formally declared null and void. The conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020 and 2023 further cemented the divide. Turkey's unwavering support for Azerbaijan meant that the gates to Ararat were slammed shut even tighter. The geopolitical alliances of the region have turned the mountain into a hostage of a much larger, bloodier game involving energy pipelines, drone warfare, and the shifting influence of Russia and the West. But there is a final, darker realization that settles in when you study the geology of the region. Politics is temporary. Plate tectonics are not. The mountain is a volcano. It is dormant, not dead. The seismic activity in this region is constant. The very forces that pushed Ararat into the sky are indifferent to the flags planted on its summit. In 1840, a massive earthquake and landslide buried the Armenian village of Akori, located on the mountain's slope, along with the ancient monastery of St. James. The mountain shrugged, and a piece of history vanished. There is a sense, among the oldest generation, that the mountain is waiting. Empires are fleeting things. The Romans held this territory. The Persians held it. The Mongols, the Ottomans, the Russians. They all drew lines, built forts, and claimed ownership. And they all turned to dust while the mountain remained. The current border, drawn by Bolsheviks and Kemalists in the 1920s, feels permanent to us because we live in the short flicker of a human lifetime. To the mountain, The wire fence is nothing more than a cobweb, waiting to be blown away by the next eruption. So, who owns Mount Ararat? Legally, the answer is clear. It belongs to the Republic of Turkey. It is guarded by their soldiers, mapped by their cartographers, and climbed by tourists who pay fees to their government. But possession is more than just jurisdiction. You cannot own a mountain that haunts the dreams of people on the other side of the wire. You cannot own a symbol that refuses to align with the name on the map. As long as every child in Yerevan draws the twin peaks of Ararat before they learn to write their own names, the conquest remains incomplete. The border remains closed. The sensors remain active. The guards remain vigilant, scanning the valley for intruders. But the wind that rolls down from the summit does not stop at the checkpoint. It carries the chill of the glaciers across the river, blowing through the vineyards of the Ararat plain, whispering of a time before the wire, and perhaps of a time after it. The mountain does not belong to the map. The map is just a piece of paper, and paper burns. The mountain is stone, and the stone endures.